the British Museum ended up buying them, but they were buying stolen goods.
I mean, wherever you stand on this historic dispute, and we're going to go into that, of course, it is a curious escalation of diplomatic tension, isn't it?
Yes, well, as William Hague says, it's not a great advert for diplomacy by any stretch of the imagination. No, it's quite extraordinary chain of events that over the last couple of days, with Rishi Sunak cancelling this meeting, and of course Labour making hay with it and describing it as a bit bizarre, and almost they're picking a fight over marbles and. Perhaps the question is who's lost their marbles over this.
Okay. I mean, it is no surprise the Greek leader would say what he said. I mean, this is a long-standing position, and this Prime Minister is known to have strong feelings on the subject. He was asked about it in an interview, and he answered the question. I mean, public opinion here in this country, if we're looking at, wider context, from what I've seen, David, on opinion polls, is, well, just about more people support returning the sculptures than not. An awful lot of people don't have a view at all. What is the opinion about this nowadays among scholars?
Well, again, opinion is mixed. I mean, one of the country's greatest classic scholars, Mary Beard, is, of course, on the board of the British Museum and presumably is foursquare behind efforts of George Osborne, the now chairman of the museum, to seek a partnership which would allow the sculptures that are in Bloomsbury in Britain to be sent on loan to Greece in exchange for some Greek cultural treasures. And of course, this does appear increasingly to be the great mission of Osborne as British Museum chairman. So essentially, opinion is split, but I would imagine that most classic scholars would love to see the Frieses reunited in Athens.
I think the British government, at least the last 2 or 3 prime ministers, have been in favour of keeping the marbles, these sculptures, in this country, which doesn't preclude the idea, I suppose, of a loan, or does it?
Well, I think it does. I think that they've set their stall out that they're not going to agree a loan under this administration. And what I do think is perhaps the most significant event of the last couple of days is Labour's confirming that it will not reopen the 1963 British Museum Act, which is the act that prohibits the trustees from returning any objects to their country of origin. Permanently, yes. So Labour has said it would agree a loan. It would not stand in the way of a loan agreed by the trustees. Now, it's inconceivable, I believe, that the trustees could agree a loan without the agreement of the government, as we are. Given the amount of money, £65 million a year, that the government pays to the museum for its running costs, and given the British Museum needs several £100 million for a forthcoming renovation project, which will come from the state. But I think the fact that Labour has said that it will not open the litigation or not open the legislation, and that its priorities are jobs and the climate crisis, I think is quite significant, because there are problems with the loan, which have been expanded on at length by the former British Museum director, Sir Neil MacGregor, who said that, well, he'd explored this when he was in charge, explored the idea of having a loan, but the problem is that the Greek administration has said that it wouldn't give them back, which of course is a problem for any loan.
Yeah, and there have been a number of looks at this which suggest if you loan it out, you just don't see it again. You don't see them again.
Unless you do get some cultural treasures that you can from Greece that you could almost hold as hostage.
Goodness me. David Sanderson, thank you. Times art correspondent. Now, let's welcome to Drive Dame Caroline Dinenage, who's the Conservative MP and Chair of the Culture, Media and Sport Committee. Hello to you, Caroline.
Yeah, good afternoon.
Welcome. And also let me say hello to Victoria Hislop, who's the international best-selling author of The Figurine. Hello, Victoria.
Good afternoon.
It's good to have you both here. Caroline, let me ask you first, what's your thoughts on this?
Well, I just feel it is all a bit bizarre, the way that it's blown up. I feel very strongly that it's unnecessary. I think there's a very good diplomatic solution that can be found here along the lines of what George Osborne was talking about when he appeared in front of the Culture, Media and Sport Committee, which I chair, just a couple of months ago. And actually, Lord Parkinson, the Culture Minister, appeared at that same hearing and didn't seem 100% adverse to the idea. In fact, he said, one of our members said to him, would you support that possibility of a loan? He said across all the items in their collection, if they wish to loan them, there is no prohibition in law, and that would not concern me. I think the only concern he had at the time that he stated was the need to acknowledge the British Museum's ultimate ownership of them, and to be sure that the loan would be returned. But, I just think a long-term loan would be a diplomatic solution that would work for everybody.
Right. And what do you make of the government's position, which I think has shifted at different points in the past. I've seen past comments from Downing Street saying it really is up to the trustees of the British Museum, but equally some worry in government about loaning out the Parthenon sculptures with the worry that they may not come back. How do you read the British government's position now?
So it's always been a slightly confused position. I was the culture minister for nearly 2 years, and the government has always had this very handy line where it's not really for us to say. It's up to the British Museum what they decide to do, because under the legislation, under the British Museum Act of 1963, it's very much the very much responsibility falls with the British Museum.
Yeah.
However, the British Museum will tell you that under that piece of legislation, they're actually prevented from deaccessioning items, i.e. removing items from their collection, unless they fall within very specific categories. So that they have to be, human remains or Nazi loot or something that's damaged beyond repair. So really the only solution is a loan. And as I say, Lord Parkinson, the culture minister, indicated just literally a month ago in front of the committee that he wouldn't be adverse to the idea of a loan under the right circumstances, which is why I'm slightly puzzled by the sort of minor diplomatic scuffle that's broken out this week over this situation.
Yeah, it's quite a loud diplomatic scuffle, which is curious. Victoria Hislop, what do you make of it? I mean, Caroline Diley is saying, well, what about a loan? That's what George Osborne, who's now chair of the museum, has suggested. Would that be enough for you?
No, absolutely not. Even the word loan is sort of a red flag as far as I'm concerned, and many Greeks. I mean, I'm a Greek citizen as well, so I sort of speak for the Greeks to some extent. The problem with the word loan is that suggests ownership of the sculptures. And the basic sort of myth surrounding the Parthenon sculptures is to do with Elgin having had permission to remove them from the Parthenon,
Yes.
from the Sultan, and that there is a firman that was given to Elgin, which was like the official permission. And actually that doesn't exist. What he was given permission to do was to take moulds of the sculptures so that they could be copied by artists, and he decided instead to take the originals. And that is really important and absolutely at the basis of what I believe is the truth and the reality, that Elgin took nearly 2 years to hack those sculptures from the face of that temple and transported them to London. And all of that was not something he was given permission to do. And essentially, yes, the British Museum ended up buying them, but they were buying stolen goods. And that is what Mitsotakis referred to the other day on the BBC Laura Kunsberg programme. He referred to them as stolen. And therefore, they can't accept them back as a loan. You can't be loaned something that you believe you actually own. Okay, let me ask Caroline Dinenage about that then. So Caroline, you were minister at that department for a couple of years, as you say. Now you're the chair of the Culture Committee. I mean, there's an account which we've all seen at different times that the Elgin Marbles, as they were then called, the Parthenon sculptures, they were taken at the time that Greece was ruled by the Ottoman Empire, and the ruling Sultan said you can have them, and signed a document to that effect. So they were not stolen, they were legally acquired. And that's what prime ministers like Boris Johnson and others have said was their understanding of the situation. Do you accept what Victoria was said?
Well, I mean, as you say, the government's position on this has always been that they were legally acquired, and there is a debate even between historians as to the detail of that and to what extent that was done legally. But I mean, the fact is, this was under an entirely different governance of Greece. This was, many, many years ago, at a time of the Ottoman Empire. Greece is the sort of the political situation in Greece. The definition of what Greece constitutes has changed several times since then. And I think there's an argument for saying that we've taken very good care of those sculptures in that interim period. But I think it's slightly dancing on the head of a pin. When when I first became a culture minister, actually the first debate I ended up having to speak at in the House of Commons chamber was on the Parthenon sculptures, or the Elgin Marbles, whatever you choose to call them. And I have to confess, at the time, some of the officials were really worried about it. And I said, look, I just don't understand. I've come from the Department of Health, where quite often if I have to stand up in the chamber, it's because people have died. In many cases, hundreds of people have died. If you think about some of the crises in our hospitals and what have you, it seems, it just seems very weird to me that people should behave in a silly way about this. I think we can have a very reasonable conversation. I think there is a diplomatic solution.
Yes.
And I think I think some kind of long-term loan arrangement, which is effectively sends the marbles back to Greece for an extended period of time, is a reasonable solution.
Victoria,
You also have to think about the precedent here as well, because if this is the ownership is disputed, the British government's position is that they're legally acquired.
Yes.
I mean, if we start handing back things that we've as a nation picked up from other parts of the world over the last 1,000 years, I mean, virtually all of our national galleries would be empty.
Victoria, I mean, you could argue that a long-term loan of the kind that Caroline's describing there may be the answer. It may go down well in Greece as well as with the British Museum, and they would be back in their home country at or near their original site. I mean, is it worth kicking up, as Caroline puts it, on the head of a pin?
Yeah, but if we're going to talk about a very long-term loan, why not actually go the whole hog and accept that they were, hacked off and not legally, taken as this is just such a myth. And the fact that the British Museum does have 99% of its collection in archives, it's got so much space, it's not going to deplete the museum. Most of it is off site or downstairs. We all know about the scandal that hit them in the summer. For 2 years, things were being systematically stolen. So the idea that they are the best place for curation is also a myth. We still haven't yet got to the bottom of that whole story. And, the Duveen Gallery, where they are kept, is often closed. It's in terrible need of repair, and the sculptures themselves haven't been that well looked after. They were scrubbed with wire wool in the early part of the 20th century, because that was considered, the right thing to make them all nice and clean. So the surfaces are damaged. I mean, there's an awful lot that is never really said about those sculptures.
Yes.
And, in the gleaming new museum in Athens, they are awaited. And it's not just a British Greek thing. Europe generally agrees, and UNESCO has a resolution, that suggests this is the right thing to happen to them.
Let me just bring this in. This is our listener, Pam.
Enemies.
Our listener, Pam, has texted this in. I bet David Cameron has his head in his hands at Sunak's completely over-the-top reaction, as will the rest of the Foreign Office, who will now have to rebuild bridges. Terrible behaviour from the PM. That's Pam, our listener's thoughts. Caroline, you say you were puzzled at the way this has blown up. You're also an experienced politician. I mean, some commentators are saying it's a distraction from bigger problems the government's facing. Is that just too cynical?
Well, I just can't think if you think about the extent to which this is dominating some of the headlines today, I can't think about what it could possibly be the government would be seeking to distract from that would be worth it on the basis of something like this. The UK-Greek relationship is very important. We've got some significant shared challenges, which things like controlling illegal migration, our joint efforts to resolve the issues in the Middle East. It would seem a very strange battle to pick. Unless there was a good reason behind it. But I agree with Pam. It feels like a bit of a diplomatic fail to me.